Hey, everybody, welcome to week 3 of Fish Trap's 2025 Big Read. My name is Mike Midlow. What is the Big Read? Well, every winter for the past 20 years, Fish Trap has hosted an NEA Big Read or a Fish Trap Reads program as a way for folks to connect during the cold winter months and read a great book together as a community. This year's book is The Cold Millions by Jess Walter. The Cold Millions is set in Spokane, Washington in 1909. It's about two brothers who are swept into the turbulent class warfare of the early 20th century. The book highlights the labor movement of the time, and in particular, the International Workers of the World, also known as the IWW or the Wobblies. It's a fascinating period of American history, one that many of us don't really know that much about. So, tonight, you'll get a special online history lesson with one of our nation's experts on the wobbly movement in the Pacific Northwest. His name is Dr. Aaron Goings. He's about to give a talk titled International Workers of the World, 1905 to 1935, and it'll run about 40 minutes. Before I introduce you to Aaron, here's some important info on the Big Read. The Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts, that's the NEA, in partnership with Arts Midwest. The Big Read is supported locally by the Book Loft, our local bookstore, Oregon Arts Commission, Eagle Cap Vacation Rentals, and Pacific Power. Plus, program partners, Cook Memorial Library in La Grande, Arts Center East, Wallowa Valley Music Alliance, the Josephi Center for the Arts and Culture, and the Wallowa History Center, and Eastern Oregon University's library. Each week, Fish Trap and our partner organizations are hosting events and discussions to help all of us understand the characters and themes in the Cold Millions a little bit better. You can see the full schedule of in-person and online events at fishtrap.org. And remember, the Big Read finale is on Wednesday, February 5th, with the author of The Cold Millions, Jess Walter, right here at Fish Trap and online too. Get your tickets at fishtrap.org. Okay, here we go. Dr. Aaron Goings is a professor of history at Peninsula College in Port Angeles. He spent most of the last 15 years a tenured history professor at St. Martin's University. He also was a Fulbright scholar and a senior researcher at the Institute of Advanced Social Research at Tampere University in Finland. Aaron is the author of 3 books, including The Port of Missing Men, Billy Gohl, Labor and Brutal Times in the Pacific Northwest. His 4th book will be published by the University of Washington Press this coming summer. It's called Red Harbor, Radical Workers, a Pacific Struggle in the Pacific Northwest. Aaron, we're super glad to have you. Thank you for being a part of Fish Trap's Big Read. It's good to see you. There you are.
Hey, all right. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. That's
Yeah,
great.
we're happy to have you, and we're looking forward to this discussion.
Cool. All right. Well, I'll get started here. So thank you so much. Thank you for hosting me, and it's a pleasure to be here. Part of a small part of this programming around the Big Read, the NEA Big Read, and around this great book, this great novel by Jess Walter, set in the Pacific Northwest during a time period, maybe my favorite time period to study here in the Pacific Northwest. And Cold Millions, I believe, came out in 2020. And here we have a Zoom talks. We're feeling awfully 2020. 2021-ish. So I'm mostly going to be talking today about it's actually the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, sometimes, well, often known as the Wobblies. I'll be using those terms interchangeably, IWW, Wobblies, etc. But also a bit about the wider context that helps set the stage for Cold Millions, helps set the stage to discuss the Wobblies. This is the period of American history often known as the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, around the turn of the century, 20th century, a time of mass social movements all across the country, often centered here in, well, if not centered in the Pacific Northwest, at least we were a major hub of several of these movements, from the women's suffrage movement to the labor left movement, highlighted by the IWW. So I've got some slides here, so I will open those up and there we go. So I'm starting here with a couple of the images. The one on the left is one of the IWW's famous images. Join the one big union. The IWW is coming, with industrial scene in the back. In the lower right side, we have a um, graveside commemoration for a IWW killed in Aberdeen, Washington during a strike in 1923. His name's William McKay. Um, and at the bottom of this sign that they're gathered around, we see here the question, "We never forget." So I like to start off talks about the IWW, asking if we are going to forget, and hopefully this this talk is a pretty good indication that we're not going to. So, like I said, I want to talk a bit about the wider context that gave birth to the Wobblies, at least in the Northwest, gave birth to the wider labor left in the Northwest, and to help us better understand cold millions. Uh, so we see here, sorry for the numbers and all the words here, there won't be too much of this, but we see here in the late 19th and early 20th century, the states of the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, are all booming in population, going from being, outposts, settler outposts of the United States to becoming better integrated. And the key to that integration is really the Transcontinental Railroad, which brings hundreds of thousands of people, including a majority of working class people. Sorry, I'm pretty sick, so hope my voice holds with me. Um, so that by the early 20th century, when the book Cold Millions is set, we're talking about millions of people living in Washington and Oregon and Idaho. And so, of course, here we to build these railroads, we're talking about deadly, dangerous work, often performed by Chinese and Japanese workers under the some of the most awful, almost unimaginable conditions. But it is that railroad that really gives birth to a Pacific Northwest, to a Washington, to an Oregon, to a Seattle, to a Portland, that starts to resemble the one we can see around us today. Major metropolitan global city. And we see here just one other indication of this, how many of these cities are really exploding in growth. Um, the explosion between 1900 and 1910, we're talking about populations going from a few hundred or a few thousand to tens of thousands of people, populations of Everett, Bellingham, Aberdeen, Portland, doubling and tripling during this era. And this is and many of the people coming to work in the West are first and second generation immigrants from, especially from Europe, but also from Asia, East Asia, and South Asia, and other places around the world. We see here in the Pacific Northwest that we're talking about a large percentage, 50% or more people being first and second generation immigrants. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the people who built and created the cities and the industries and the roads that helped create the modern Pacific Northwest. We're talking about a lot of that work being done by immigrants and their children, a real diverse array of immigrants. And when these newcomers arrive in the Northwest, whether we're talking native born migrants or or immigrants born abroad, they'll move into these cities like Seattle, like Spokane, which is featured in Cold Millions, like Aberdeen and Hoquiam, which are significant cities in the early 20th century, and they'll settle into very diverse ethnic neighborhoods, where a lot of the radical activity that we'll get into here in a second is going to be centered in these cities, in these in these ethnic enclaves, in these immigrant halls, in places like Seattle, Spokane, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but when these people arrive, they've often been told, sometimes by the railroad companies, by railroad company agents, that when they arrive in the Pacific Northwest, life will be easy. They'll make their fortune, sort of a smaller version of the overall myth of gold, a pot of gold on every street corner. But when people arrive in the Pacific Northwest, they're often very disappointed by what they find. We see here on the left in a wobbly poster or wobbly sticker asking workers to stop buying jobs. And here on the right, we have what's called a shape up, in which workers, longshoremen, dock workers, had to actually stand around and compete for jobs on the docks, often in a humiliating method of acquiring work. So even to get these jobs, workers are having to either purchase the jobs that may or may not even be real jobs, and certainly are going to be, in almost every case, dangerous, difficult, dirty, cold, wet jobs. And in other cases, they have to compete right out in public, sometimes with dozens or hundreds of other workers. These are some of the reasons why workers flock into unions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, hoping to change the situation, hoping to collectively, rather than individually, challenge and change society. And these jobs, when they are working in these jobs, especially, but certainly not exclusively, the lumber industry, from logging to sawmilling to milling, they're working in the most dangerous, and in the case of logging, the most deadly job in the Pacific Northwest, where dozens and then hundreds of workers are dying each year and each decade. And when workers protest, we see the other dangers. Here's an image from the Wobblies, a cartoon suggesting that if somebody does protest, there will be a police officer to beat them over the head. I don't think that's even a little bit of an exaggeration. But the lumber industry and mining were often very much male industries, with a few exceptions. But women, of course, also work now, work then, have always worked, and often faced extremely difficult, sometimes very dangerous jobs as well. The main form of women's employment was domestic service, working as maids. But another one would be working as boarding housekeepers. We see here in the lower left an example of a boarding house. You can imagine the difficulties of taking care of, cooking, cleaning, and keeping house for a dozen or more working people, single, often working men. And then industrial laundries, one of the most dangerous forms of employment I have a example of that here from Aberdeen, Washington, where a Finnish American laundry worker in Aberdeen named Ida Kampa, a Finnish woman in Aberdeen, had her hand crushed by the machinery. She was fortunate because she was part of a union and was able to get union insurance. This is an era, especially in the very first few years of the early 20th century, where we don't even have workers' compensation uh, um, laws that would provide money to those hurt on the jobs or to families after a worker was killed on the job. And then, of course, no old age pensions until the 1930s. So we're talking about difficult, dangerous, desperate times for working class people. Um, so the Wobblies are, of course, part of the labor movement and part of the wider labor left in the Pacific Northwest and in the United States and North America during the early 20th century. The other major institution of the left at that era is the Socialist Party. I have an image here. The top image is actually a Finnish workers' hall, Finnish Socialist Hall from Astoria, Oregon, where hundreds and hundreds of Finnish socialists would meet regularly in the early 20th century, producing a daily newspaper and then a weekly women's newspaper called Toveritar. And the Socialist Party, sometimes allied with the IWW, sometimes not. Certainly focused a lot more attention on running candidates and participating directly in the political process. But they elected socialist candidates to office all across the Pacific Northwest, from west to east, from mayors to a state legislator near Olympia, Washington, city council people. We're talking about a very vibrant social movement that was occasionally allied with, tied to the IWW. But it is the IWW that really we're here to talk about. Um, the industrial workers of the world, the IWW or Wobblies, often called the one big union, although there is, confusingly, there is a Canadian organization called the One Big Union that is similar but not the same. So the organization really grows out of a wider left-wing working class milieu of the late 19th century, early 20th century, but it's founded in Chicago in 1905. And some of its major principles included forming industrial unions. So we're talking about mass unions of all workers in industry. Up to that point, most unions only, with a few exceptions, were fairly small institutions um, uh, of usually white, often native-born men. So what happens to the majority of the working class? They're often left out of these unions, and those unions, most of them belong to an umbrella organization that still exists, the American Federation of Labor. Today it's called AFL-CIO, but it was a umbrella organization of many different small trade unions. The IWW actually kind of humorously called it the American Separation of Labor, because rather than including all workers into one big union, the AFL had many small unions that, to the IWW, they believed weakened the movement. But this is, of course, industrial workers of the world. And from the start, they were very interested in not only organizing those working class people who had some amount of privilege. So whether that was because they were men, whether that was because they were white, whether that was because they spoke English, whether it was because they had a relatively high paid working class job, like a printer in a news for a newspaper, or a saw filer in a lumber mill. But instead, they wanted to organize all workers, the millions and millions of workers who desperately needed to improve their lives, but had no real mechanism to doing so. And the Wobblies, although they didn't necessarily oppose participating in elections, that was not their focus. They understood that prior to 1920 nationally, half of people in the United States, women, could not vote, at least outside of states like Washington, where women won the right to vote in 1910. But also, migratory workers had a very difficult time voting, establishing residency, as well as people under the age of 21, as well as immigrants. But also, they believed, and I think maybe we can see some evidence of this in the rest of the 20th and early 21st century, that politics was a bit of a corrupt game, a fixed game, a rigged game, where a working class person didn't have much power. Where workers had power was on the job, where workers could challenge a very authoritarian system, the workplace, private ownership, where the boss didn't even pretend that life was democratic, where workers had any rights. So workers, instead of focusing on politics with the IWW, they focused on something called direct action, challenging power relations where they actually had a chance to make a difference, which was on the job. And the Wobblies were very, very aggressive, very assertive, and certainly not shy about their beliefs. So here, I'll quickly read here the preamble of the IWW, which begins with, the working class and the employing class have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among millions of the working people, and the few who make up the employing class have all the good things in life. I remember first hearing this when I was in my late teens or early 20s, and it really resonated with me then. And it still seems like such a powerful, powerful statement. The rest of the Constitution, IWW Constitution, is also worth reading if you have a second. Um, But again, Wobblies are very interested in organizing, were and are, because they still exist. They still organize workers who are often left out of the mainstream labor movement, often left behind. They were organizing coffee workers, baristas, decades before the Starbucks unions we've begun to hear so much about. Organizing sex workers long before that started getting more attention the last few decades, especially from labor journalists like Kim Kelly and the like. But women, especially in cities and towns, were critical to the IWW movement. Pardon me doing a little self-promotion here, but my next book here is up on the screen. And I love this image because it takes place during a lumber strike. And all the workers on strike are men, because at that time, with rare exceptions, it was men working in logging camps and in sawmills and in shingle mills. But here on the picket lines, we have workers, working class families, women at the front of the line, children. This Often these parades were described as being a mile long. Even in towns of 10, 15,000 people, they could turn out 1, 2, 3,000 workers for things like this. But and I think if you read or have read Cold Millions, this won't be terribly surprising. When women, when children, when any working class person challenges the police, challenges authority, challenges their employers, they they're often facing a great deal of danger. So during these strikes, during protests, during the free speech fights, it's not just men who are being beaten, who are being arrested, who are being bloodied, who are sometimes being beat unconscious. We also have anyone who dared challenge the authorities. We have here a woman in Aberdeen who got photographed by a Seattle Star photographer in 1912 before the police confiscated and destroyed the cameras of those photographers so they couldn't continue getting these. Um, but in Cold Millions, we have probably the most famous member of the IWW, or certainly the most famous woman, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, often known as the Rebel Girl, who plays such a central role in bringing attention to and helping to lead the Spokane free speech fight of 1909, 1910, that's at the center of Cold Millions. But my friend, I love the title of this book. My friend, fellow historian Heather Mayer, she uses that name, Rebel Girl, to talk about the different ways that women and gender influenced the IWW and how the IWW, how women were involved with the Wobblies in many, many ways beyond um, uh, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, although she is certainly very critical to the movement. So the IWW in the Pacific Northwest, it is, as is true of so many early 20th century social movements, the Northwest is a real hub of the social movement. In this case, I think there's a lot of evidence that the Pacific Northwest is probably the strongest, or the place where the IWW had developed their strongest roots, planted their strongest roots, had the most persistent members, members who remained in the movement for the longest, where they had the most members. And much of this grows out of the goings on in Spokane around 1910. That is, again, so featured in Cold Millions. Spokane is 1909, 1910, probably the strongest IWW town in the Northwest and maybe even the entire West. That is where they begin publishing this tremendous newspaper, weekly newspaper. I think many people consider it the best labor newspaper ever created in the United States, certainly one of them, The Industrial Worker. So it's in Spokane where they begin to publish that as a weekly. They publish editorials, they publish news, they publish international news, letters to the editor, but they also publish songs and cartoons. It is a great place to get a lens into working class culture of a century ago. But I really want to emphasize this because it often gets lost in the retelling and in the mythical version of the IWW. The Wobblies weren't just migratory workers. They weren't just hobos going from town to town and job to job. They weren't just floaters. They weren't just young single men who would show up in town, cause some problems, try to fight authority, and then move on. That's a myth. Certainly, migratory itinerant workers were important to the IWW, and certainly in the Spokane free speech fight, we see that. But Wobblies are active in rural, so in the countryside, in logging camps, in agricultural, in farms, and the like, but also in cities where they often develop and plant their deepest roots, where they build their halls and purchase their halls, and they have public meetings for years and years, and where they publish newspapers, most notably Industrial Worker. And it's often in these immigrant neighborhoods where the Wobblies plant serious roots. Um, but the Northwest was really has been from the start of white settlement very much a resource extracting region. Whether we're talking furs, fish, forests, farmlands, um, uh, uh, much of the industry, especially prior to World War II, had to do with extracting things out of the ground and out of the water. And in the early 20th century, lumber or timber, they were king. Most wage workers in Washington state in this time worked in lumber. And I think this is pretty uncontroversial. Um, it is in lumber where the Wobblies have the most influence, where for decades and decades, well, for at least 2 decades, they have a great deal of influence in the logging camps, in um, in lumber mills and the like. The IWW's one of their major leaders and historian, Fred Thompson, said that the lumber industry was, quote, the site of the Wobblies' greatest triumphs. And we see here an image of from World War I era of loggers holding the industrial worker and one big union signs and flags, pennants. Um, but it is really these free speech fights that are so important to cold millions and so important to helping bring the Wobblies to the public attention in the Northwest and in the wider West. These were often struggles waged by Wobblies and Wobbly sympathizers um, to fight for their right to give public demonstrations. Um, because without the ability to speak in public, they could not spread their message. And their message was often, in Spokane, for example, that workers were being exploited, certainly on the job by their boss, but also by these employment agencies that the Wobblies called job sharks. These employment agencies would require workers, potential workers, to pay to get a job. But when workers paid for those jobs and went out often 10 miles, 20 miles out into the countryside to go to that job, the job would often not exist, or it would only exist for a day. These agencies were corrupt in all different kinds of ways, and the Wobblies set that out as something they could challenge and change. And they protested these employment agencies on the streets, often right in front of them. But employment agencies, like other employers, let's keep it historical here, like other historical employers, when they get their power challenged, when they get their money challenged, they will act collectively, just like workers sometimes do. Employers will act in cooperation to change, to fight back, to protect themselves and their class interests. And in Spokane, they go to the city council and demand that street speaking be banned, which they do. And this is very important to the book Cold Millions. With street speaking banned, the Wobblies are no longer able to organize. So they begin to openly violate the law in 1909. This goes into 1910. And they decide on a strategy that will eventually become very important in Wobbly history. They advertise this street speaking ban around the country, and they bring hundreds, even thousands of workers into Spokane to challenge the law, to fill up the jails, and force the city to spend a lot of money to jail, feed, try them in court, etc. In Spokane, they end up winning in the spring or late winter of 1910. They overturn the law and they're able to organize publicly. And they're able to, for the next few years, continue publishing the Industrial Worker in Spokane, which is such an important part of us learning about IWW history. But there's other free speech fights, including in lumber towns of the Northwest, which is where the Wobblies really have their greatest influence. We see here from 1912, this is from the biggest lumber strike up till that point, where thousands of workers, sawmill, mostly sawmill, but also shingle mill, and loggers strike, protest for several months. And it's very much an inter-ethnic strike as Greeks, Finns, South Asians, many other workers, men and women marching along and fighting. And they dig some roots in the lumber industry so that in the years ahead, they'll be able to continue challenging employers. So I don't have too much more time, but I want to finish with a few slides talking about what happens to the Wobblies as they fight for, as they challenge authority, as they challenge local cities over laws that are repressive, or challenge employers, challenge bosses on the job over oppressive conditions. What happens in essentially every single case is that, at least prior to 1917, local officials, police, courts, mayors, city councils act often violently alongside with members of the local Chamber of Commerce to break the IWW, to break their strikes, to break their movement. This happens again. Initially, it's very much done by local people, local officials and local employers, local police acting violently to crush these organizations. Here in Aberdeen, where the Wobblies have their first big Pacific Northwest lumber strike, the wealthiest man in the area, this banker named William Patterson, organizes a vigilante committee called the Citizens Committee. And here's what he has to say about it. We organized that night a vigilante committee, a citizens committee, I think we called it, to put down the strike by intimidation and force. We got hundreds of heavy clubs of the weight and size of pick handles, armed our vigilantes with them, and that night raided all the IWW headquarters, rounded up as many of them as we could, and escorted them out of town. So they destroyed IWW property, destroyed their halls, and kicked them out of town, often acting side by side with police who would use jails, but also use expulsion from town. A big part of this attack that was very, very common anytime the Wobblies would organize and have some success would be to attack and destroy their halls. These were urban centers of IWW activity, sometimes described as their homes, places workers would go, and if they're migratory, where they would often sleep, where they would eat, where they would sing their IWW songs. We're talking more than a dozen of these halls are raided in the 1910s, just in Washington State, for example. But employers and the media work side by side with vigilantes and the police to crush the organization. And they do this by trying to create a narrative of the Wobblies that often has been repeated since then, of them as outside agitators, outsiders who come in just to cause trouble, or in other cases, calling them violent criminals, depicting them in a certain way, othering the Wobblies so that locals and so that especially powerful locals will feel more comfortable attacking them. The only one of the biggest and most powerful groups involved with the union busting with IWW attacks were these national labor spy agencies, most famously or infamously the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, that world famous for spying on, for breaking unions and the like. They helped to develop blacklists of anyone who was involved with the IWW or other labor unions that they would distribute among all employers, basically do not hire lists. And sometimes these labor spies were so successful and so admired for their ability to spy that local officials in different towns around the Northwest would hire a spy to actually serve as a member of the ostensibly public police department. In this case, in Aberdeen, we have a labor spy named Templeman, who becomes appointed as chief of police. So, and today, of course, places like Aberdeen and Hoquiam, Raymond, etc., Everett, these don't seem like very big cities, but in the early 20th century, those are some of the biggest cities in the Northwest, top 5, top 10 cities, when these lumber towns really, really matter. So, um, the last thing I'll talk about here is so the Everett massacre is such a horrible incident that where we really see local officials and their violence taken to the limits. In Everett was very much one of the centers of the lumber industry, a place where thousands of sawmill and shingle mill workers lived and worked. And it was, in fact, in the 1910s, a center of the labor movement. Well, employers there in 1915, 1916 decided to break the shingle weavers union. And to help fight against the breaking of that union, Wobblies from Seattle took a ship called the Verona in November 1916 up the Puget Sound, tried to land at Everett. When they got close, according to the story that has been passed down, the history that's been passed down, the sheriffs and the vigilantes on shore said, you can't land here. The Wobblies on the Verona then said, the hell we can't. The next thing was, who are your leaders? On the ship, Wobblies say one of their most famous statements ever, we are all leaders. At that point, firing from the shore commences. Several Wobblies are hit with gunfire, are killed by these vigilantes and these sheriffs and sheriff's deputies. Many fall into the water. We have no idea how many Wobblies got killed. The Verona then goes back to Seattle. And just to give some idea of how much power employers and the police and the vigilantes had, when the Wobblies got back to Seattle, they were arrested because in the melee that happened, some of the sheriff's deputies got hit with gunfire too. So I'm out of time and I don't want to keep you all evening, but I do want to end this by really expressing how important the IWW is in Pacific Northwest history and how exciting it is to me that we have novels like Cold Millions and novelists like Jess Walter who are interested in telling part of that story. and doing so in such a inviting and exciting way, to where I think even people who don't read much in the way of novels would certainly find a lot to enjoy there, in the, in the at least historical basis for the book. Um, but I think that's a starting point for helping to understand more about the early 20th century. And I hope I helped at least a little bit with that, to think about the conditions that workers faced in the early 20th century, the ways that workers got together and challenged some powerful institutions and individuals, and how in city after city, industry after industry, how those with power responded to the Wobblies when they did challenge those with power. So, with that, thank you for joining me. It's been my pleasure to be a small part of the big read. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Aaron Goings, thank you so much for being a part of this. It's wonderful to have historians like this who gather and hold this information and share it with all of us. I do have a question for you, Aaron. If you've inspired people to learn more about the labor movement of the early 20th century, do you have any recommendations of museums or resources online, in person, where folks can go to learn more?
Yeah, great. Boy, um, we're very lucky. So I live in Tacoma, and I'm very lucky. I live only a few blocks away from the Washington State History Museum, um, right in downtown Tacoma. And they actually have a huge number of exhibits about the early 20th century, about immigrant life, about social movements, about industry, and about workers' movements. They also have a very good website, just the Washington State History Museum. Um, Beyond that, Washington State has long been a real center for digitizing resources. So if you want to really dig into some primary sources, you could go to the Washington State Digital Archives, which is the online branch of the Washington State Archives based in Olympia, but they also have branches all over Washington. In Oregon, the Oregon Historical Society in Portland, their museum is also a terrific source. Um, uh, Beyond that, I very much recommend taking a look at at old newspapers that can really provide you a lens into um, into this world. One way to find those is looking at the Chronicling America website, maintained by the Library of Congress, that has millions of newspaper pages. And really, I suspect there's some pretty cool people choosing um, what gets digitized, because a lot of the digitized newspapers are workers' newspapers, labor newspapers. Um, and then there's just a lot of websites out there. I would, you could even just Google IWW songs, IWW music. Utah Phillips, who unfortunately passed away maybe 10, 15 years ago now, was this tremendous IWW folk singer who told many of these stories through song in a way that far better than I could. He produced an album with Ani DeFranco that won a Grammy some years ago. Um, so um, there's many, many different ways to learn about the IWW, and many of the songs that Utah Phillips tells that he sings or he sang actually came out of this great little songbook called the IWW's Little Red Songbook, that was actually created in Spokane during the era of Jess Walters' book Cold Millions. So all of these institutions all of these great cultural creations like the Industrial Worker, the Little Red Songbook, the IWW as an important part of the Northwest, so much of that really has its basis in Spokane and in the era that Walters depicts in his book. So, thank you.
Professor Aaron Goings, thank you so much for spending time with us. Hey, folks, if you missed the beginning, we had a little technical glitch. We'll have the full recording of Aaron's talk up as early as tomorrow. Also, you can go back and look at Fish Trap's Big Read Kickoff, where a lot of the songs that Aaron just talked about were sung for our kickoff, which was Songs of the People, and most of it came out of the Red Book. The Cold Millions by Jess Walter. Please go to fishtrap.org and learn more about the upcoming events, including our finale with the author Jess Walter. Until then, I'm Mike, and go to fishtrap.org to learn all about it. Thanks for being a part of this and being a part of the Big Read. Take care.